The city wore the rain like a second skin, a glassy veneer of neon that slid over every surface and reflected in strange ways when you looked straight at it. The Ventura skyline was a chorus of glass spires, each pane a different story, each story a possible future that could be glimpsed in the moment someone thought to squint hard enough at the reflection. In the harbor district, where the old brickwork leaned into the new, and the new leaned back, a smart loft hung above a network of dust-lit walkways and water runoff conduits. The loft was called the Glass Churn by its builder owners, a nickname that no one bothered to correct because the place lived to churn. It went on churning, day or night, with the soft whir of phase drives and the hum of data streams that fed the walls with content and memory. Nix woke to a familiar ache, an ache that was less a pain and more a memory of something that hadn't happened yet. It was a sensation that lived in the back of the skull, a pressure of possibility pressing against the skull's bone. The body shifted in the bed, a chaise longue of cables and soft leather that had grown into Nix's skin in a way Nix herself barely noticed after the first few weeks of occupancy. Nix wore augmentation the way others wore jackets, thin, practical, utterly necessary. The implants didn't just extend perception, we combat fatigue. They allowed Nix to see the underlays of reality fractures, echoes, the kind of anomalies a non-augmented observer would miss entirely. The loft's glass walls were not ordinary glass. They were composite layers of memory and projection, a kind of window that could show you the past's weather, the future's weather, the weather of other dimensions if you coaxed it correctly. Right now, the glass showed a ripple of rain along the spire across the district, each droplet catching a line of light, a suspended moment that looked back at Nix as if it could talk. But Nix preferred not to stare too long at the glass. The glass could talk in a dozen voices at once if you listened to it with the right implants and a clean enough mind. The door hissed, a soft sigh, and the room brightened with the arrival of Dr. Rhea Calder, the reality engineer who had hired Nix to be an informal monitor within a dynamic that was less a system and more a living organism. Rhea wore a coat of matte black that absorbed the light rather than reflecting it, and her hair, short, practical. Shock of silver at the temples was the color of a storm front about to break. Her eyes, augmented beyond ordinary human sight, looked at Nix with the clinical tenderness of someone who has spent their life measuring fissures that others call miracles. "The mirrors are singing again," Rhea said, a soft edge to her voice that suggested she did not want to admit the truth in plain words. The phrase was her own, a line she used to describe the way the whole mirrors, those reflective memories people wore on their walls, sang when the city's data fabric snagged on something it couldn't quantify. Nix rolled onto a shoulder, the metallic scent of the loft's air scrubbers wafting over like a polite, invisible wave. Nix's augmentation included a set of microports along the temples and a shimmer of nano-coated skin that allowed the interfaces with the mirrors to slip through the flesh without friction. Nix's life had become a mosaic of those shards. Some of them memories of events that hadn't occurred, others glimpses of futures that might never arrive. The effect was both intoxicating and terrifying. A drug and a cure. A map of possibilities that could drown a person if they let go long enough. Rhea crossed to the kitchen island, where a line of holographic monitors hovered in mid-air. A cluster of lines and shapes that moved with intention, like a swarm of luminous insects that carried secret messages. The loft's center was a field of soft light, a living apparatus that breathed with the same rhythm as the city. "The fracture index is climbing," Rhea said. "Not in the air or the grid, but in the memory margins, in households. It isn't just your duplicates that are slowing down their own sense of self. It's the whole block of home people who now mistake a memory for something they did or something they should have done but didn't. It's chaotic and increasing in frequency." Nix's chest tightened at that thought. The idea of a citywide memory drift, the possibility that your own childhood could be replaced with somebody else's, or with an image of how your life might have been if you had taken a different turn, made Nix feel ungrounded, unmoored. It wasn't that Nix wanted to erase possibilities. Nix was built from possibilities. It was that the price could be too high, erasure of a person's sense of who they were, if a duplicate felt too real, and you mistook yourself for a copy. Helix is fishing again, and they're not just after pointers, Nix said, testing the air with a careful breath. Nix's voice carried a note of low humor that was meant to ease fear but did not. They want a map of the duplicates as proof that there's something to harvest. Rhea opened her mouth, as if to speak, and then closed it again. She studied Nix for a long moment, eyes narrowing in a way that suggested she could peel away the skin of a problem and lay bare the bones beneath. "We've known this is coming," she finally said. "Corporate interest in reality fragmentation is not something you can pass around the table and pretend doesn't exist." Helix has been mapping the weave for years now, watching for a glitch to exploit. Her tone was clinical, almost bored by the monotony of it all. But what they want is not just data. They want a signature, a way to say this particular fracture belongs to us and no longer belongs to the city that gave it life. Nix's mouth thinned into a line. The thought of Helix as an entity that could own a fragment of someone else's existence filled Nix with an unpleasant combination of fear and anger. Ownership of a person's memories, of a self, was the ultimate assault, a thing that should be impossible in a world that claims to be free enough to bend reality without breaking it. The door to the loft opened again, admitting a new wave of rain-scented air and two figures that telegraphed authority with their posture more than their uniforms did, Helix agents. The taller one wore a overcoat that had a sheen like new mercury, with sleeves that moved as if they were made of a liquid that refused to settle. The other wore a helmet that reflected the world in tiny, perfect fragments, bits of life and light that reorganized themselves every time you blinked. "Dr. Calder," the taller agent began, voice tinted with a hiss that suggested a tool being manufactured to do a certain job and nothing else. "We regret the intrusion, but your presence here is a risk to the grid. We've observed anomalies that indicate you've engaged in unauthorized phasing. We're here to collect and correct. You'll be compensated for any data you've contributed, and there will be no further guest invitation to the party." There was a sting of mock courtesy in his voice, as if he were addressing an unruly dog rather than a person who could threaten civilization. Rhea did not respond at once. Her eyes moved to the two men, then to Nix, then back again. Finally, she offered a small, almost courteous smile. "What you're after is a patch," she said almost cheerfully. "A patch that interrupts the fracturing at its source. But there are consequences. Every patch changes the rules. If you patch here and now, you erase something. You erase someone." The taller agent, Cade Voss, as Nix knew, raised an eyebrow. A line of assessment ran behind his gaze, as if he was trying to decide whether to pity or fear this uncertain, stubborn pair in front of him. "That is a consequence, yes. The patch is necessary to preserve the integrity of our system." He paused. "And you know the price of not patching." The conversation that followed was a dance of words, a tightrope walk between ethics and necessity. Nix listened, not merely to the words, but to the cadence of the conversation's heartbeat, the ticking clock, the hum of the wall screens, the echo of their presence inside Nix's own mind. The Helix agents, apparently with no intention of leaving anytime soon, began to scan the loft. The rooms filled with soft, synthetic wind that smelled faintly of ozone, a byproduct of the devices that kept reality running as if it were a live wire. Rhea recognized the need to act, to push back. She spoke of a plan to sheath the glitch within a controlled loop of reality, one that would allow Nix to survive and Nix to observe the patch from a safe vantage, a place where Nix could still exist while the memory's oversaturation was kept from causing irreversible harm to either Nix's identity or others' identities that shared the same space. The couple's plan required the use of an old subnode within the loft's server lattice, a place that had been left intentionally underguarded for experimental runs that never fully materialized. It was the kind of place the corporate world would call a liability, but a city's mavericks might call a sanctuary. An old data core, half forgotten, buried in the structure's guts like a forgotten engine beneath a ship's hull. They moved with quiet urgency. Nix's implants hummed with a familiar resonance, their own system telling them the patch could be done if they could reach the subnode before Helix could tighten their grip. The corridor lights flickered in a way that suggested the walls themselves were excited by what was about to happen, as if the house itself recognized a turning point in the fabric of reality and wanted to be part of it. The path to the subnode wound down to the building's maintenance spine, a corridor that had not seen daylight in years. The old tubes of data, the way the cables braided across the ceiling like a living vine. The smell of copper and dust. These were the scents of a different age, a time when reality had a more obvious shape. The hall's walls bore the scratches of 1,000 experiments, a map of the city's attempt to bend itself to human will. Nix found the subnode, a chamber of humming metals and glass that reflected more than a person could stand on first glance. The core was a black box. Not a box, but a feature, a portal of potential. It meant Nix's own identity would be altered in a manner that could not be anticipated, an upgrade and a risk, a leap into something that felt like a second childhood, a reassembly of a self into a new shape. Nix stood at the core with Rhea and listened to the weaves of data, the murmur of the network's living heart, a pulse that seemed to echo Nix's own heartbeat back at them. They could hear the city beyond the loft, harbor districts, rain and traffic, the distant chimes of a clock tower, the slow, patient breathing of something large, something older than the city's neon. The core was a throat, a mouth that could speak reality into being, and it looked down on them with a patient, indifferent gaze. The Helix agents, now joined by a contingent of armed technicians, appeared in the doorway with guns that appeared to be candles, fluidly burning, ready to melt reality into the kind of fear a man carries when he looks into the eyes of a monster he cannot kill by brute force. They forced themselves into the chamber, shoving aside the room's silence as if silence itself were a commodity to be traded. Their leader, Vaz, spoke again with the same edge of suspicion, but the tremor in his voice now suggested something close to desperation. Enough of this. You want to patch or rewrite. We want results. You will yield. Rhea stepped forward. She did not back away. Her voice remained even, though Nix heard for a moment that it took a small breath at the back of her throat, as if she inhaled a little hope that there might yet be a third path between the nothingness of ruin and the too bright future of control. The weave has a limit, she said. There is a renal kidney of data areas where the system is not just a set of rules, but a living memory of why those rules exist. You patch things in a way that grabs a memory and erases it. You might as well amputate a limb. We patch to heal, not to erase a person. Voss glanced at his team, then at Nix. He saw the connectors, saw the way Nix's body moved with a dancer's control, saw the way Nix's implants glowed with an inner fire. It was something he rarely encountered, a person who could either be the recipe for success or the recipe for disaster, depending on whether the patch was done successfully. He was not sure which answer he preferred. Enough words, he said. If you're going to patch, hatch now. If you're going to rewrite, tell us exactly what you intend. Then we'll decide whether to sever your ties to this facility and start the process of your erasure. We have a city to stabilize. The decision hung in the air like a sharp instrument balanced on a thread. The choice to patch and erase Nix, or to rewrite and risk a cascade of consequences across the weave, had a gravity all its own. Nix's own internal clocks spun faster than their heart could manage, a double rhythm of fear and exhilaration. The thought of losing the possibility of a self was enough to tighten every muscle in Nix's being, to push Nix toward the patch, toward the old, hard, clean solution of a boundary drawn around one life so that others could live without threatening its boundary. And then Rhea spoke again, this time with a boldness that surprised even Nyx. No patch, no erasure. "We will rewrite," she said, her words crisp with conviction, but not in a way that erases anything. "We'll rewrite the rules of the weed itself, so that duplicates can exist without being trapped inside a single contested timeline. We'll build a shared space for conscious existence across parallel selves." A murmur ran through the room. The Helix agents stiffened, as if some invisible tether had snagged them and refused to let go. The subnode trembled, as if it were listening to the possibilities being spoken into existence. The core's deep hunger for something new and different, and somehow better than the previous state. Nyx felt that hunger too, that strange craving for a future where life did not require translation through a singular line. The thought of living across a million versions of yourself, each version offering a slightly different choice, was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. The risk of losing any one of those selves to oblivion was high, but so was the risk of losing oneself by clinging to an old method of being. The patching would have the engine run a new script, an algorithmic lullaby that could calm the fracturing and coax the system to treat each mirror's memory as a legitimate facet of a kind of multi-self identity, rather than an artifact to be controlled or destroyed. It would require Nyx to calibrate their own amplification in a way that would reorganize not just their own mind, but the minds of anyone connected to the weave. Nyx would become a map, the central spine of a whole new architecture of reality, a skeleton around which the living body of the world could rebuild itself. The risk, however, lay in the fact that the weave was not a quiet, forgiving thing. It had a memory of its own, a willful sand in the gears of any attempt to rearrange it. It had been shaped by decades of government and corporate experimentation, by millions of hands that did not always share the same concept of progress. Sometimes, progress meant control. Other times, it meant freedom, but rarely both with ease. The weave would not submit to a mere patch, or to a patch plus rewrite. It would push back, and the price often could be measured in human terms as well as structural. In the end, the two women achieved a rare consensus. They would rewrite, but they would do so in a way that allowed every conscious being within the weave to choose their own continuity. It would be a global approach to reality, not a patch, not an erasure, not a single bright future that crushed the past. It would be a transfer of authority from a handful of technicians to the many who lived within the grid, a kind of democratization of the very fabric of existence. The process began with an interface RIA at the heart of the core, Nyx tuned to the phase slots that would fuse their own identity with the larger memory fields. And the Helix agents standing on the periphery like wolves at a fence. They wore their fear openly now, their faces betraying a sudden uncertainty in the face of something they could not control. The data took on a visible form, threads of light and memory that stretched from the core to Nyx and back again, weaving a new pattern into a living loom. The first step was gentle, a partial integration that allowed Nyx to see through the weave's eyes for a moment, to catch sight of the other Nyxes alive across the city, scattered in apartments, in trains, in parks. It was not a vision so much as a revelation, a map of the self that existed in 1,000 rooms, each one a life, each one a choice. Nyx's own body inside this new continuum was no longer simply a vessel but a node, a hinge that could tilt the entire system toward a unity that did not erase faces, but shared them. The patch of old times, old memories, and old promises would be kept, but their authority would no longer be exclusive. For a moment, the world trembled. The lights in the glass churn pulsed, as if the loft itself were flexing its breath to accommodate this transformation. The air thickened, then grew lighter, as if the room had exhaled a held breath and found that the air could still be breathed after the exhale. In a city that lived on the boundary between risk and possibility, a breath like that could be enough to tilt the balance. The Helix agents watched with a careful, almost reverent awe, as if the weavers of reality were performing a dance they could not join. They had been prepared for a fight, not a communion, a patch, not a gathering. They were not prepared for a rewrite that would use their own system against them, to reprogram the rules with a fairness they were not capable of granting themselves. And then time slowed. The weave's own presence, old, patient, inexorable, began to loosen its hold on the room. The subnode's core gave a soft, almost grateful sigh, as if recognizing a long-lost kin. The memory threads, which had previously bound so many into a single path, now rearranged themselves into a web that could sustain multiple lines of existence without erasing any one of them. It was complicated, beautiful, terrifying in its clarity. In the midst of this, Nyx's own identity, constructed from a mosaic of lives and choices, felt newly coherent. The duplicate Nyxes were not being erased or dissolved, they were being invited, given a voice and a stake in a shared future. The line between Nyx and the other mixes blurred, then dissolved into something bigger than any one version of the self could claim. The sense of self did not disappear, it multiplied. The mind expanded outward, like a galaxy, where every star, every Nyx was still there, still Nyx, but no longer separate from the others. Ria's hands moved with the precision of a conductor guiding a symphony. She guided the weave with a careful, compassionate touch, ensuring that the line of identity would not be severed by a sudden, violent rewrite. She tuned the resonance between Nyx's implants and the core so that the will of each Nyx remained intact, with its own sense of purpose, its own memory of its own most meaningful choices. The Helix agents, now aware that their power to command and to erase had shifted beneath their grasp, could only watch as something old and new took shape in front of them, a reality that was not a single line, but a living fabric of lines that could cross and interact, sometimes touching, sometimes running in parallel, but which could always be traced back to a center that belonged to all. Nyx felt the city outside, too. It was still drenched in rain, but there was a new rhythm to it, a steadier, calmer beat that suggested a future where even catastrophes could be navigated with grace rather than fear. Duplicates that might have once disappeared or become something else entirely now existed as living, breathing aspects of a single, larger system. It was a kind of peace, an uneasy peace perhaps, but a peace that could hold. It was still a perilous enterprise. The weave did not surrender its power without a struggle. It threw up a storm of memory fragments, a clamor that sounded like 1,000 voices, all calling to be heard at once. Some of them old losses, some of them triumphant discoveries, all of them trying to find a place in this newly woven reality. Unit of Patch, the core fought back with a stubborn persistence, a stubbornness that reminded Nyx how old the weave was and how little of this world was truly new. But the patching, the rewrite itself, did not require the erasure of any single one of Nyx's versions. It instead built a shared horizon that could accommodate all. It required a relinquishment of certain kinds of power, a relinquishment Helix would never willingly give. And for a moment, as the threads interlaced and the web found its new geometry, it became clear. The fight would not be a battle, but a negotiation. A careful, delicate negotiation between those who believed in control and those who believed in possibility. In that moment of delicate balance, the loft's screens, normally full of city data and marketing illusions, began to display something that felt almost sacred. A map of every living Nyx, each Nyx a node in a network of existence, each node connected by paths that could be traversed without losing what it means to be Nyx. The duplicates did not oppose this. They welcomed it as a new kind of home, a place where they could be themselves and still be part of the bigger whole. Voss, seeing this, found himself at a loss he had not been prepared for. The idea of a self that was not a boundary but a portal unsettled him in his bones. He was a man who had built his career by closing doors, by sealing off possibilities to maintain control. He had not learned to consider the importance of open doors, of a house that was bigger than himself and his single set of rules. He felt the shock of that revelation in the spaces where his power used to rest, in the language he used to persuade others to bend, and in the fear that he might be left behind when the world finally chose a different path. The rewriting did not erase Helix's influence. It did not even render them powerless. It simply made their power dependent on something more than mere data and a strong ledger. The Weave took their ability to determine reality's shape for a single faction and turned it into a shared, collaborative approach to existence. It was not naive or naive. It was a mature compromise that refused to crumble when faced with the enormity of the human heart's capacity to imagine something better than a world where a person could be erased for the sake of a patch. When the moment of the sealing event arrived, the moment when the new reality's code would switch from potential to present, Rhea gave the final command. Her voice bore the ancient authority of someone who has spent lifetimes wrestling with the constraint that reality imposes on souls. "Let it be," she said, with a calm that made her seem taller than she was. There was a hush, then a light that flashed bright as a star, if such a star could exist in a room that was not a room, but a seam between realities. The core's hum rose to a cry, a sound that Nyx felt in the marrow of the bones, a sound that told the nervous system. This is new. This is right. This is inevitable. The world did not simply change, it redefined what a self could be. Fractures that had previously been a threat, a danger, a trap that could swallow a life whole, became something else. A chorus of selves, a chorus of lives that could be lived in parallel, and yet held together within a single truth that no one would own to the point of erasure. Existence became a field of choices offered to every conscious mind, a map of possibilities where the traveler could choose a line on the horizon rather than be forced to walk a single one. The price of this freedom remained the same as any price for a leap into the unknown. Not everyone would accept it, and some might lose themselves in looking for certainty where there was none. In the hours that followed, Nyx learned to navigate the new world with care. Nyx could still access the old, familiar memory streams, but now those streams did not pull a person toward a single destiny. They offered a choice, and the person could decide to switch tracks at any moment. A memory of a past life could become a door a person could walk through. Not a trap to trap them forever in a single fate. The duplicates, no longer echoes of a life that might have been erased, became living, breathing equal contributors to the same reality's future. They were not a chorus of nothing. They were a chorus of something to be cherished. And one of the engineer, Rhea called her. The act of rewriting had demanded a personal cost she did not reveal openly. In the moments far from the cameras and the tower's eyes, she found herself less a technician of reality and more a gardener of futures. Her own identity, an identity built of years of calculations, of curves and measures, of the quiet dignity she carried into every room, began to drift into a form that was not a loss, but a reimagining of what it meant to be herself. She could still measure a problem and solve it, but she also began to sense the beauty in not knowing the answer, in letting the world teach her again what it could be. Nyx felt a tenderness toward Rhea that surprised them. The sentiment was not romantic in a conventional sense, but human in the way a person can feel for someone who has stood atop a cliff with you when the rocks start to crumble and still chose to leap with you rather than away from you. If Nyx had ever believed in a single, fixed future, one that would not bend to the sun or flood with rain, their belief now stretched to include the possibility that a future could accommodate not only their own survival, but the survival of others' sense of self as well. As days turned into weeks, the city responded to the rewrite with a cautious curiosity that felt almost ceremonial. The seawall, an immense, living boundary that reminded the city of the ocean it once faced, began to show signs of the new architecture. People found that they could recall memories that had never happened to them or that might someday happen, and yet they could let those memories rest in the same place without turning them into a weapon to be used against others. The home mirrors, those devices that could turn a life into a loop and then into a map of infinite loops, found their new identity not as a trap, but as instruments of introspection, a way to engage with one's own life as a dynamic process, not a fixed artifact. The corporation's response was slow, cautious, entirely human in its fear. Helix learned that it could not simply seize control of a patch and command reality to bend to its arbitrary will. A new reality demanded consent, and consent required trust. It was a hard thing to manufacture, and Helix's leadership, which had grown used to top-down control, found itself outmatched by a community's willingness to reimagine the world, not simply to push back against the old reality. In the final scene of this particular chapter of the story, Nyx returned to the glass churn, which had become a sanctuary and a studio, a place of counsel, stories, and strategy for living with a new truth. The curtains, so often a nuisance in old rooms, were reimagined as living screens that could display the city's memoryless horizons, the points where a life could branch and continue or stay on one line. Nyx stood near the walls, looking out at the glass reflections of the Ventera night, now a mosaic that connected the past with a future that seemed both farther and closer than ever before. Rhea joined Nyx at the windows. Their silhouettes close, but not touching in any way that could feel like control. The city's rain made a curtain of light that blurred the lines between real and not real, and between memory and future. The two of them did not speak for a long moment, letting the sense of something momentous ride quietly between them, a shared breath of relief and possibility. "Do you think this is the end?" Nyx asked softly, almost to the glass, as if the window would answer in its own quiet way. "Or is it only the beginning of something we can't yet name?" Rhea's response took its own time to come, as if the future itself was choosing what it would tell them. "The end of one thing is often the seed of another," she said at last, her voice both practical. "But the world is not what it was, and that's not only a problem. It's a possibility, an invitation to become something more than what we were prepared to be." The two of them turned to watch the city's reflections swell in the glass, 1,000 Nyxes and Rheas and many others, each living with a continuity they could call their own. The weave had become a living thing they could walk with, not a leash they wore. The world had learned to exist as a chorus rather than a choir, with each voice given space, its own cadence, its own truth, and its own right to be heard. As the rain slowed and the night settled into something gentler, the city's lights began to pulse on a rhythm that felt almost like a heartbeat, one that told a story of resilience and change. Nyx stepped closer to Rhea, a touch of warmth in their gaze, not a promise of a forever that stays the same, but a vow to continue moving forward, to continue bending reality toward a larger, more inclusive truth. And in the quiet, the soft click of a door latch, a distant siren then fading, the hum of the core finally settling into a steady, intentional calm. The loft's glass and walls formed a single, unbroken image, a city that could be many things at once, a life that could carry many selves, and a reality that belonged to everyone. Not to a few. The future did not promise simplicity. It promised possibility. It offered a universe that could be measured neither by rules nor by memory alone, but by the trust that the living would be allowed to choose which future to inhabit, and that no one would be erased for simply choosing to exist. The night closed in, and the churning light within the glass churn dimmed down to a soft glow. The world outside, the city, the water, the air, breathed with a new kind of ease. Nyx and Rhea stood facing the core, which glowed with a pale, patient light, a sentinel of the new order. "Are you ready to test it again?" Nyx asked, not with bravado, but with a shared sense of responsibility. Rhea smiled, a quiet, almost secret smile that suggested she knew a truth no one else did, and was happy to keep it for herself, if it meant protecting the fragile, new harmony of this world. "Always," she said, "but not tonight." They stood side by side, watching the city's reflections ripple in slow, patient waves. The weave had been given a new life, a life that could accept difference. A life that could thrive on many paths instead of insisting on one. It was not a guarantee of ease, nor a promise of perfection. It was something more radical and precious, a way for existence to mean more than one thing at once, for people to be many without losing themselves. In a corner of the glass churn, the old screens flickered once, twice, then settled into a gentle, comforting hum. The night breathed again, and Nyx and Rhea found a new rhythm within it. A rhythm that spoke of a future in which memory did not trap but expanded, where the self did not die for the convenience of a system, and where the city's heart, once a magnet for control, now beat with the promise of shared, living truth. If someone asked what the two of them had accomplished, they would tell them a story of a doorway opened not by force, but by trust. A doorway that allowed many to step through at their own pace and keep what mattered most, their own lives, their own memories, and their own right to exist in more than one way. It was not a definitive ending, but it was a beginning you could feel in your bones. The first note of a symphony in which every voice could be heard, not silenced, and in that sense, reality itself began to change, not in a blaze of fire, but in a slow, careful dawn. A dawn in which the home mirrors kept singing, yes, but singing together with us, as equals rather than objects to be exploited or broken. A dawn in which the outcast and the engineer found a way to stand side by side. Not as opposites in a struggle for existence, but as companions in a world that finally allowed them to be themselves. All the versions they could be, without fear of being erased. The city's rain stopped, and a new light settled over the harbor. The glass churn glowed with a pale, hopeful luminescence. In that glow, Nyx saw a future that was not about proving something to someone else, not about outsmarting a system, but about discovering something meaningful within themselves and with others. That existence, everywhere, could be a shared, evolving truth, rather than a solitary, fragile line. The story of their night and of the new world that followed left a question behind for any listener who would hear it long after the screens dimmed and the city's heartbeat settled into a calm rhythm. It asked, if reality can be rewritten so that life persists across many selves, what does it mean to be you? The answer was not a single word or a single gesture, but a choice, again and again, in each moment, in every mirror you looked into, and in every life you could choose to live. The answer, for now, was simple, if heavy with promise, to exist openly, with others, in a world that would not let you vanish for the sake of order. The end of that night did not come with a verdict or a declaration. It came with a gift, a possibility, a permission, a trust that the future could be lived, not as a fearsome, brittle expectation, but as a brave, ongoing collaboration of many selves and many lives. And that was enough to let the dream begin anew.